I want to thank the committee from the Informatics Society here in Turkey for inviting a storyteller to speak. I don't often get invited to speak in front of groups of people who are working at the back end of a culture that I use extremely actively. So I want to thank our host for bringing me here to Ankara. I wanted to start with asking you some questions, if I may. First is, how many of you have taken a picture with a cell phone? Hold your hand up. Taken a picture with a cell phone. All right, how many of those people have uploaded that picture onto the internet? Either Facebook or some other thing. All right, how many have done the same thing with video? They've taken video as well and uploaded it. All right, how many of you have edited video on a cell phone and uploaded? Well, that's pretty good. I'm impressed. Okay. We come from an organization in California, in the San Francisco Bay Area. And in that relationship, we've been close to the IT world and creativity for many, many years. I celebrate this year the 25th anniversary of an email address called jello@well.com. The Whole Earth Electronic Link was one of the first public communities online, and I played a role for the last 25 years in trying to get cultural communities to use IT and particularly digital media as a mechanism of representation for communities and as a way to engage the public. Like the other speakers today, I come thinking about this gentleman because he's had such a profound impact on my life, and I think it's fair to say he's had a profound impact on the planet. Steve Jobs was a complicated and difficult person, but those of you who might have had the chance to see his 2005 commencement speech at Stanford know that he was also a profoundly good storyteller, obviously one of the best presenters in the world. In that story, he talked about being adopted and he talked about being fired from Apple. But he also talked about the story of what it was like to get the diagnosis of pancreatic cancer. I think all of us know that that is a ruthlessly unforgiving disease. It's about a 2% survival rate. And the idea that a man with such power at the top of a massive organization had to come to terms with saying goodbye to his children, to his wife, to his family. Trying to put his life in order must have been tremendously complicated. And obviously, as a courageous man, he fought very hard against that disease and beat the odds for almost 6 years. We think about Steve here because in many ways, Steve's idea wasn't just to think different. It was to live your dreams. It was to find a way to express yourself in new ways. And I would argue, quite simply, that the 20th century was a century that was about social cohesion built through centralization, built through a common way to hear a story through radio and television and film. And that what was pent up in what it was our previous agrarian identities, because 150 years ago, all our great-grandparents were peasants in one way or another, in vast, vast parts of the population. That as we became urban citizens, we got disconnected from our stories. And I would argue the 21st century, in exact opposition to the 20th century, is about diversity as the basis of social cohesion and diversity down to individual, authentic voice. When we look at the screen culture as a kind of economy of production, we don't associate it with other economies of the industrial era, particularly the use of raw resources. But in some ways, our culture is a raw resource. And just as the resource needs for massive manufacturing meant that we tore down a lot of mountains and we chopped down a lot of forests, so were, in a sense, our stories colonized by the mass media in one way or another. And the internet explosion is a lot about, we wanted a lot of different voices. We wanted a lot of different screens. And most importantly, we wanted our own screen. We wanted our own Facebook page, our own blog, our own way to express ourselves. And this need was deeper than a political need, deeper than a sociological need. It's a kind of fundamental need to be signified in your life, to believe that your life has meaning and purpose, and that's observed. Arguably, in our old villages, we could do that. We could be observed by our communities in different ways. But as we kind of changed the nature of community, where we weren't living with multiple generations of families that had known the families for many, many years. My wife's mother's mother was from Turkey. And the village she lived in, that same family lived there for 1,000 years. They were olive pickers. And they knew everybody, and everybody knew them. But just as that process of reclaiming our forests to become sustainable in lumber, or reclaiming our mountains or our garbage heaps to become part of our lives as opposed to a problem in our lives, I think we need to reclaim our stories in a way that makes sense for this period. So I want to talk very briefly about a couple of projects that we're working on in which we're using the app environment. And I think the point's well taken. We'll also use the web. It won't just be proprietary, but we're using the app environment as a distribution method for stories in communities. I spent this last weekend in the first of my organizations only on an iPhone workshop in Istanbul. My colleague Bursu over here from Hacettepe University and I wandered a group of 12 people around with their cameras to shoot, record, edit, and put together films as we walked through the streets of Istanbul. The idea is that those stories have a position in place from people who are from Istanbul, who have a connection through their history, but also from tourists, myself, who were becoming somewhat aware of difference through the process of telling these stories. Projects can be part of cultural reclamation, but they can also be part of essentially renewing what we know already, remembering as a form of learning. And these story projects, like this one in the African American neighborhood of Knoxville, Tennessee, is allowing communities to have conversations through the stories, not just to post stories as the official history, but then to give back their own story of the same place, of the same location on the map, as a point of sharing. Now, obviously, the geographic information systems available through Flickr and Facebook and Google and other ways obviously allow you to build your own GIS, and the do-it-yourself GIS movement is enormous. But this idea that it's available with signs, or your cell phone tells you, right here there's a story, is like awakening the ghosts of memory that exist in all built landscapes, and frankly, all natural landscapes. So we're taking the same process and moving it to our National Park Service in the United States as a method for people to experience interpretation of natural settings as well as historical environments. So we'll use this same process to look at some important neighborhoods in Washington, D.C. in relationship to the lived experience of the civil rights movement in the United States, just in time for the 50th anniversary of Martin Luther King's famous "I Have a Dream" speech that he gave in 1963. For us, this is a completely new environment that relates to the discussion about the government's role and the business organization's role in giving us the ability to do this, but it's also a different way to think about the way we'll plan. Because these stories are not just ways to say, this wonderful thing happened, but it's also a way to talk about value. I walked through the market this morning in the Citadel up at the top, and I saw how this community had sustained that market. Down on the main streets, you have beautiful stores that represent the great chains of modernity, their clothes and shoes and different things. But up in that Citadel, you had a sense of who you were. And I would argue the stories of every one of those shopkeepers is profoundly valuable to the Turkish cultural identity. And just as you've maintained their ability to maintain those shops, having those stories marking all of the history of these communities in every neighborhood, in every place, is a process of restorification. And I think that process is critical to the renewal of all our societies. And I thank you for this moment.